So, welcome to our latest Field in Focus technical presentation series. For those of you who are joining this type of webinar for the first time, we ran some Field in Focus presentations when we were going through our environmental approvals for the central sites. And most recently, we did a presentation that focused on our East VMFRP sites. And now this series today, this presentation will focus on our EES West activity. Before I get too far ahead, I would like to acknowledge and pay our respects to the traditional owners and Aboriginal communities. We recognise the diversity of their culture and deep connection that they have with the lands and waters that this project will be working on. We value the relationships that traditional owners and Aboriginal communities have for the health of people and country in this area, and we pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. So as we kick off, a little overview of what the presentation will look like and what we've got in store for you today. My name is Kate Kernaghan and I'll be kicking us off with an overview of the project. I've been the media engagement and communications lead on the project since about 2021, so relatively new to this very lengthy project, followed by James David, who will take us through the environmental assessment process. We'll then hear from Roisin about the EES West specifically. She's our project manager for the East and West sites. And once we've been through that detail, we'll circle back with some next steps and then have a session of questions and answers if anybody has some follow-up questions that we might not have covered throughout the presentation. So I'll just remind everybody that we have a Q&A function. If you've got questions that you'd like to submit, just click on the Q&A dial at the top of your screen and it'll open up and give you the opportunity to submit a question. And then at the end, we'll roll through those and work through them, answer them to the best of our abilities. Roisin and James, you can probably close your cameras if you're feeling a little self-conscious while I go through the master slides. All right, the Victorian Murray Floodplain Restoration Project. Most of the names registered for this webinar I recognise as being interested parties along the way. So forgive me if some of this content is already familiar to you, but I'll run through it just for consistency. The floodplains next to the Murray River have evolved to periodically receive water. So historically, the Murray River would spill onto the floodplains, creating rich, lush landscapes teeming with life, and the water would spill back into the river channel, and that would pulse periodically like a heartbeat. So that richness and diversity of the floodplains were a heartland for traditional owners and sustained large communities for tens of thousands of years. And today, traditional owners are carrying on that legacy. Having said that, as our towns, cities, agriculture and industry have grown, we've changed the way that the river flows to suit our purposes by using weirs and dams. And while this has created many benefits for regional communities and economies, it does mean that the water no longer flows naturally in the same way it once did. And the Murray River can no longer water these floodplains with that pulsing activity to the extent and frequency that it would have happened naturally before this regulation. And the condition of the forests and woodlands of the Murray River floodplains has been declining fairly rapidly over the last few decades, which means many of the river red gum and black box communities are stressed and in places dying, and particularly those that are further away from the river channel or permanent Anna branches, creeks and wetlands. So the Victorian Murray Floodplain Restoration Project, and I'll just click into the next slide, is the solution to remove the blockages that stop the floodwater from flowing where the water's most needed. So what is VMFRP? VMFRP is a strategic environmental watering project that will help the Victorian floodplains receive support so that we can water the ecosystems that face a future with less water. So the works and measures that are proposed under VMFRP are based on the most current research and will be monitored, and there'll be an adaptive management plan in place for each of these sites along the system so that we can deliver the right amount of water at the right time and only when needed, essentially doing more with the water that we have. And you can see on the screen there, there's a listing of the different project sites that comprise the VMFRP, which in the east is Guttram, Benwell and Gumbower. The central sites is Naya, Vinifera, Belsa Youngera and Hatter Lakes North. And then the subject of today's presentation are the Lindsay and Walpolla Island sites to the west. This next diagram I want to draw your attention to is a representation. It's not totally a linear discussion, but a representation of, if you think of the watercourse being right through the middle of that figure, and that gets water every year, there's water in the river. Then as we step out from the watercourse, the different ecosystems have different needs and different frequencies. And it's all related to level. So if parts of the landscape are higher near the river and then drop away a little further out, you know, it'll all be related to what water it can receive and how often it needs water. But essentially, local communities and traditional owners have told us that the evidence is clear in the landscape. Forests and woodlands are in decline. Many of the river red gum and black box communities are stressed. And that flooding is the catalyst for much of this biodiversity that needs to be able to survive and thrive. And the continuous wetting and drying cycles are both equally important to seeing that happen. Without that cyclical pattern, we're not going to get the ecological responses that we need. So, as I said, Lindsay and Walpolla Island are the subject of this particular Field in Focus session. There are furthest west sites as far as we go towards the South Australian border. They're home to rare and threatened flora and fauna species, like the planigale, cute little planigale. They're a prime floodplain restoration conservation hotspot. There are some significant cultural heritage values amongst the landscape and that require the landscape to be healthy to protect those values. And they are home to the first people of the Middle O'Malley, Lachi Lachi, Ninganta and Nyeri Nyeri. I've got that pronunciation right. So why Lindsay Island? Lindsay Island is part of that major step towards restoring the floodplain's health and protection. So it was one of those identified sites that without infrastructure, without works and measures, there physically isn't the capacity to sustain and protect the ecosystems that are there. And similarly at Walpolla Island, again, it's that strong traditional owner value space. It's about the connectivity to the floodplain system and the role that Walpolla Island plays. And again, it's a water dependent sensitive site, and that drying decline needs our intervention. Sorry. And as you can see, I've popped a slide in here where you can see the response from the environment that we get when we are able to apply a little bit of watering. The example that's on the screen is from Hatter. And honestly, that's because there's some infrastructure down that way that allows us to see this before and after response. I can't actually give you a before and after for certain parts of Lindsay or Walpolla because at the moment we physically can't get water there. I'll show you another version of the difference that environmental watering can make. So this shows the river red gum tree conditions before watering and after. And this one's at Lindsay Island, that's a bit closer to where we can get water. And then the last slide that I've got is again that planigale that I was so excited to share with you before. Not quite the same level of excitement around the frog, but indicative of the species that we're trying to support by having a healthy and well-supported floodplain. So what does the infrastructure look like? We've got some examples here. I just wanted to show you what a containment bank looks like. So we're not talking about a great big wall. We're talking about things like existing tracks that act as containment, and it's subtly just about the level within the floodplain. The water can come up to it, and instead of overlapping, it spills out further. So it's not a big and imposing piece of infrastructure in the landscape when we talk about containment banks and existing tracks. And then we've shown horseshoe lagoon regulator and another small example of a regulator. These are the more modest example pieces of infrastructure. And then I'll show you the one at Mullaroo Creek as an example. And then the last one there is an example of a very large regulator. I think that's the sort of thing that's being proposed for Berrabee. Landscape. And the last slide that I've got to present before I hand over is just intended to give you a sense of the proportional difference between the inundation area that we hope to achieve by putting some works and measures in place versus the construction footprint. So if we're looking at Walpolla Island and Lindsay Island, it's something in the order of you get 98% footprint benefiting from a 2% construction impact. And when I say construction impact, that means we consider access tracks on the way in and the immediate site where we're building infrastructure. Those are the sorts of impacts that we're having. It's the ability to get the necessary equipment in and the teams in to build the supporting infrastructure that I showed you in examples in those previous slides. So proportionally, that's the level of impact versus benefit that we're trying to illustrate for you with that figure. And there you go. That might be enough from me for a little while. I'll hand over to James David, our environmental approvals manager, and you can take it from here, James.
Thanks, Kate. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the session. May as well just jump straight in. Kate's obviously given us a bit of background here, but back in 2019, 2020, following a good while of project development, 9 projects were referred as part of the VMFRP program. Through that process, it was deemed necessary that all of them required assessment under the Environmental Protection Biodiversity Conservation Act at the Commonwealth level. That 4 projects required an environment effects statement. There are 2 west projects, Lindsay and Walpolla, and 2 of the central projects, Hatter and Belsiangera, as you can see there. The remaining projects were required to undergo an environment report process, which for all intents and purposes is very, very similar. It's almost the same, but I won't dwell on that now. We'll just look at EAS West. The central projects went through their processes back in 21, 22, and we got through the SEAC public processes and got project approvals in late 23, early 24. The east and west packages were held up a little bit by the floods, and we resumed work on those late last year. Next, Kate. We've been developing these projects for years, and we're now at that stage of where we are needing, in order to obtain the project approvals, to really assess the potential effects of the projects, and that's both the impacts, which are largely construction based, and the benefits, which we'll see through project operation. We do that through a series of assessments that all look to better understand the environment that's out there, to look at how those values and how we can avoid those values, to avoid and minimize impacts, but also modify the project operations or modify some of the infrastructure to really maximize the benefits. So we're in the final stages now for the environment effects statement for West, as I said, covering those two projects there. I guess it's important to note at this point that the focus of the environment effects statement is Victorian and Commonwealth legislation. There is New South Wales legislation of relevance, but that is outside the scope for the EAS. However, while we're not addressing that New South Wales legislation yet, there is a real and important interface with New South and matters of relevance to the construction and operation of the projects. So it's just a matter of timing for when the project will address those obligations and address that New South Wales legislation. And there'll be elements of that that are relevant pre-construction or during operations, depending on the matter. But either way, consultation through this phase, through the EAS phase, is still really important with New South Wales and the stakeholders, and understanding that we do have a process in place for working through those New South Wales matters. So I mentioned a series of the assessments that we're working through. There's 15 of them that are part of the environment effects statement, and that suite of 15 you can see there. We've generalised that list a bit. It's a common list to all environment effects statements across the state, regardless of the type of project that we're talking about. Environmental improvement projects like these, or mines or quarries or power lines, or whatever the case may be. Thanks, Kate. So each specialist has their own methodologies unique to the particular discipline, but there is a real common thread to them. Desktop assessments, they delve into the existing information that was out there, existing data, literature, other research. They've all involved site visits to varying degrees. Some of them have been only needed a couple of days out there. Some of them have been weeks and weeks and weeks in the field, looking through our construction footprints. And it's important, I think, to note as well that each of them have gone back to site. While most of this field work was done in 21-22, most of them have gone back to site. Sorry, they've all gone back to site since the floods to look at the effects of those floods. And that's been really beneficial, because that means our existing conditions is less of a point in time and more of a spread and a range of natural variability. Some of the studies have required modelling. They've all required consultation with stakeholders, and some of them do require a degree of ongoing baseline monitoring to inform our project operations. So this slide shows the process that we go through. We'll come back to it later on with the timeframes that we're looking at for this, but as I mentioned, we're in the final stages now of the EAS preparation. Documentation's then placed on public exhibition for 30 business days. And during that time, there'll be some information sessions where members of the team here and some of the specialist leads will come up and provide the opportunity to talk through in more detail about what's in the documents, what the findings are. And of course, during this time as well, everyone and anyone is invited to make a formal submission to the process. And we've got a bit more info on that later today as well. After exhibition, we move into a public inquiry phase. The inquiry members are independent, appointed by the Minister for Planning. They'll consider our documentation, they'll consider the submissions that are both written and then presented verbally if the submitter wants to do that. There's no difference in the overall weighting of a submission should that happen, but they'll consider all of the submissions and then they'll make some recommendations to the Minister for Planning, typically around some modifications to the project, but ultimately whether or not the project should or should not proceed in its current form or with some recommended amendments. The Minister for Planning's assessment then usually builds on those recommendations and comes down with the same conclusions, that the statutory decision makers should approve the project, should not approve, or should approve subject to recommended amendments. That latter scenario is what we saw for our central projects for Hatta, Belsar, Naya and Vinifera. Should be approved with recommended amendments, but Burra Creek is one that, for reasons, should not proceed. So that project's no longer part of the VMFRP package. Once that minister's assessment is made public, that will then inform the approval decisions that follow it. So we're in the assessment phase. The approvals phase follows the Minister for Planning's assessment, and the key approvals there for what we are currently working on are those 3 pre-construction approvals: planning scheme amendment, EPBC, Commonwealth approvals, and of course the cultural heritage management plans. I haven't touched on that, but there's a lot of work going on for a number of years and continuing to build those cultural heritage management plans out ready for submission. I think before I hand back the mic, I will just touch on the planning scheme amendments in a little bit more detail. All council areas in Victoria have a planning scheme. They really prescribe how land can and cannot be used and developed. Typically, you'll be most familiar with planning permits with that one and what you can do, permits for particular uses or development. Planning schemes can be amended. There's a legislative process for that, and this is a really common pathway for infrastructure projects in Victoria. Really to rationalise, I think we can jump to the next slide, Kate, sorry. Really to rationalise the obligations of the planning scheme. So instead of a big suite of planning permit triggers that would differ across the 4 council areas that VMFRP operates in. Obviously, East and West is all Mildura, which makes it a bit easier for one. But really, in lieu of planning permit conditions, we're proposing an incorporated document that would switch those triggers off, but replace them with conditions set out in the incorporated document, really to streamline the delivery of the project without circumventing the obligations of the scheme. Typically to the satisfaction of the relevant authority. And what we've seen to date with Central is that's either been the Minister or the Minister for Planning or the Secretary of one of the government departments. Those conditions apply only within an extent that's mapped under a specific controls overlay that we'd be requiring to apply to land affected by the project. It is really important to note that if that is applied to any private land, it is project specific. It does not change the use and development rights or controls or anything that landowner would be able to do under the current planning scheme today.
All right.
And that's me.
Thanks for that update. Next, I'll introduce you to Roisin Feeney, so Project Manager for East and West sides. And Roisin's going to run us through some specifics for EES West. Over to you, Roish.
Thanks, Kate. Hi, everyone. My name is Roisin Feeney, and I'm the Project Manager for the West sites. Thanks for taking the time to join us today. I just wanted to start off with the VMFRP objectives. The VMFRP objectives are centred around protecting and restoring these high-value floodplain ecosystems. This is proposed through better aligning the frequency, duration, and timing of managed inundation events to improve the resilience of these floodplains to threats such as climate change. Key drivers of the projects are to facilitate traditional owner aspirations for floodplain restoration and to provide social and economic benefits to the community while avoiding, minimising, and managing potential impacts of the project. I can move to the next slide. Yep. So this is an overview of our Lindsay Island project, which is the furthest west project in the whole VMFRP program. Lindsay Island is one of our largest projects and also has our largest piece of infrastructure, which Kate mentioned earlier, which is the Werribee regulator. You can see here on the map that the construction footprint is in yellow. And there are a number of small red icons, which are where we're proposing infrastructure to be sited. The coloured areas, the blue, green, pink, lighter green, they are all water management areas, which when combined, they make up the modelled inundation extent, which for Lindsay is just under 6,000 hectares. The modelled inundation extent is the output of each of the hydrodynamic modelling scenarios combined to present an area of land to be inundated during environmental watering. So the different water management areas, so the different colours on this map, they can be operated separately. Some scenarios are gravity fed, others are pumped. And in this way, this allows quite a lot of flexibility for the project during operations. If you just want to move to the next slide, Kate. So similarly, this is the Wapola Island project map. Similar to Lindsay, the yellow represents the construction footprint. The red icons represent where we're proposing to site infrastructure, and the water management areas are the coloured areas. The modelled inundation extent, which is the combination of those coloured areas, for Wapola Island is just a little over 3,000 hectares. So as you can see, both Lindsay and Wapola Islands are very large projects with large potential inundation extents. And this area is really where we can see benefits from the project. So there is quite a large benefit potential from both of these projects. If you just want to go to the next slide. So the project is proposed to have two phases, which is construction and operations. The construction phase includes the construction of a number of pieces of water management infrastructure. These include things such as regulators. So Kate showed a few of those earlier. We've also got another access track here that has a, which is on a bank. So you've got the access track on top. The bank is, it's not a huge elevation, but it does provide capacity to hold water. We also have things like culverts, which can be single culverts or banks of culverts, drop structures, spillways. We have hard stands like that image there. They're gravelled hard stands for pumping infrastructure. There is no permanent pumps at either of the west sites. If you attended our presentation a couple of weeks ago east, you would have seen there were permanent pump stations, but at west there is not. We really just have these hard stands so that temporary pumps can be brought in and out during operational events. Also in the design of the so just say one more thing about construction is that the projects have been designed to avoid and minimise impacts as much as possible through activities such as siting infrastructure where previous disturbance has occurred. So that's quite common along access tracks. We've kept to existing tracks where possible, or through avoiding features of significance through design. Thanks, Kate. Okay, so the second phase of the project is the operational phase, which is designed to target high-value areas for watering while allowing flexibility in response to prevailing environmental conditions. The aim of operations is to restore ecological condition, to supplement natural flooding by reinstating appropriate wetting and drying periods that are closer to what we would have seen historically before river regulation, and to provide resilience during periods of drought or climate change. So during operations, before, during and after watering events, the floodplains will be monitored and the watering requirements will be reviewed annually through established government processes, which will be guided by the scientific results of the monitoring. Okay, working together. The projects have been shaped by engagement for more than a decade, from project inception to the business case development and now through to the assessment process we're currently undertaking. Since 2019, the team has been working on specialist assessments, infrastructure designs and the cultural heritage management plans for the project sites. A community reference group was run from 2021 to 2023. With local knowledge from this process included in the designs and assessments. Engagement with private landholders, as well as with organisations such as Trust for Nature, is ongoing as property plans are developed with them. We've been working closely with the Registered Aboriginal Party to build an understanding of the shared values and aspirations. This includes working closely with the First Peoples of Millewa Valley, as well as our archaeologists and First Peoples State Relations on the cultural heritage management plans for both sites. Both Lindsay and Wappola Island are highly sensitive environments, which we are very cognizant of, and the collaboration between all parties strengthens both the cultural and ecological outcomes. There is very strong community support to protect the cultural heritage at these locations. So for EES West, the project is working currently on finalising a lot of the assessments and working closely with the impact assessment unit and the technical reference group to review and to finalise these documents. The contents of the environment effect statement is informed by the scoping requirements at the state level and the EPBC Act controlling provisions for protected matters at the Commonwealth level. So James went into this briefly before, but there's a broad range of topics that are assessed as part of the environment effects statement. Some of the larger assessments include the ecology reports. So we have both terrestrial and aquatic ecology reports. The water assessments, so there's surface water and groundwater, and these draw in the updated hydrodynamic modelling, which we've been undertaking for the projects, which is where that new modelled inundation extent has come from. The heritage assessments, which includes both Aboriginal cultural heritage assessments and a historic heritage assessment, as well as a number of other assessments such as project benefits and assessments of matters of national environmental significance at the Commonwealth level.
All right. I think that's pretty much it. Was there anything else that you wanted to add, Roche, while we were giving an update?
No, I think that's it, but happy for anyone to send through questions in either the chat or in an email afterwards if there are any questions in that.
Yeah, of course. All right, thank you. So to wrap things up, I just wanted to give everybody a bit of an understanding about the next steps for our West sites. So within the EES process that James showed you, we'll pretty much be wrapping up the preparation phase of our assessments and writing all of the reports and getting that all drawn together as we see out the final weeks of this year. And then we're aiming for a public exhibition and public inquiry phase into the new year in 2026. So you can see by those red lines, there's sort of some indicative timing as to how that'll all roll through. And of course, the timing, once it's out of the project hands around decision making and approvals, is harder to articulate when it's not within our control. So what's next? So for our central sites, Naya, Vinifera, Hatter and Belsa, we've got our key approvals in place and we're pretty much working towards construction readiness. We have a funding application in for construction, and as soon as we can get an outcome there, those central sites will be the first point of focus for constructing these approved works and measures. For the east sites, they're very similarly placed along that timeline in terms of having the environment report being finalised at the moment and readiness for a public exhibition in 2026 and the remainder of those approvals. And then, as I said, the west sites will also be finalising things as soon as possible to continue through the approvals journey. When I say public exhibition, for anyone who wasn't following the central sites, it's just a reminder that you can go into our VMFRP project portal. So if you go to vmfrp.com.au, you'll be presented with a website and a project portal. And perhaps it's helpful to have a look at that project portal and have a look at the central sites that have already been through their public exhibition to understand the level of detail that will be included in the documents, because that will help inform your expectations for what you're likely to see when West goes on display. And so similarly for the planning scheme amendment documentation, it might be helpful to have a look on our project planning portal for a reference there in case you want some more information, or of course get in touch with our team. Speaking of staying across the project's events, news, activities, if you haven't already signed up to our quarterly newsletter, we call it the Floodplain Babbler. And seasonally, we send it out to anybody on our mailing list, and it just gives a little update of topical events and activities in the region that might be relevant to VMFRP. We update on each of our sites. We draw your attention to anything that might not be specific to VMFRP, but relevant to our project in contextually speaking. And where we can, we pop in a feature story that might be of interest. So if you haven't already signed up to that, please do. And then this is a screenshot of the project planning portal and the website interface. So again, if you go to vmfrp.com.au, you'll be presented with a screen that looks like what you're seeing on the slide there. The one on the left is our website, and the one on the right is our project portal. So I recommend that you jump in and have an explore there. The project portal has videos, interactive maps where you can zoom in or navigate to some before and after images. If you're interested in looking at that Werribee regulator, go into the project planning portal, go to the maps and just navigate to the west sites, and you'll be able to see Werribee and click on it and have a look at that before and after as to what that landscape change will likely look like. So it's a really handy tool so you can direct your own interest. And that's about it in terms of the content that we had prepared for you today. So let me have a quick look and see if we've got anything in the Q&A, any questions that people have asked. PK, you've got a question. Why is there a pipeline back to the river on Walpola West rather than releasing it back onto the floodplain for more inundation outcomes? Roisin, do you want to answer that one, or is that something that I should take to the team and get back to PK on? You're on mute.
The pipeline for Walla Walla West comes out of the creek, so it's with a temporary pump station on the creek to the north of it, pumping out of the creek and filling Walla Walla West. And the infrastructure to the west side of Lake Walla Walla, it would hold the water up and back out onto that section of the Walla Walla West floodplain. So it's not draining it back into the creek. It's getting water out of the creek to fill that area.
Actually, while you've got the mic there, James, PK was also asking about whether or not the changes to Commonwealth environmental legislation will impact our projects, the EPPC, etc. Or are we already in a different train?
No, to my knowledge, no. The recent changes won't. I don't think they apply to us. I mean, we're still running that to ground at the moment. Usually, what happens with Commonwealth updates is when assessments are underway already, they apply all the legislation and framework at the time of the referral and the decision to embark on the assessment. That's what applies for the remainder of the assessment process. But that said, we are still running that one to ground just to make sure.
To double check. Okay. All right. Do we have any other questions in the Q&A? As I mentioned at the start of the call, if you can always email the project team. So that's info@vmfrp.vic.gov.au, or you can go on our website and there's a contact us form. So if you leave the webinar event and think, oh, that's what I meant to ask, you can always still get in touch with us that way. And what we'll do is send a thank you email after this session with a little follow-up of what we discussed and an invitation to share the link where we publish this recording in case anybody in your network might have been interested and perhaps missed the session. But if there's no further questions, I might leave it there for the day and just thank everybody for taking the time to check in with the project. It's starting to get very exciting as we finish our reporting and see how the report's all stacking up, and we can't wait to share that with you in 2026 under a public exhibition setting. All right, well, thank you again for joining us. I'll stop sharing and I'll end the session for everybody.